Some people build their entire lives around the image of having it all together. The perfect kitchen, the perfect table setting, the perfect smile that tells the world everything is fine and beautiful and exactly as it should be. Sandra Lee built that image for 20 years and the world bought it completely. And then at 55, everything she had constructed with such careful intention began to come apart in ways that nobody who watched her on television could have predicted. What happened to Sandra Lee is not a simple story about fame or failure. It is something much more human and much harder to look away from than either of those things. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. The girl will learn to make something from nothing. To understand the tragedy of what happened to Sandra Lee at 55, you first need to understand what she built her entire life trying to escape. Sandra Ann Christensen was born on July 3, 1966 in Santa Monica, California. She came into the world in circumstances that had very little of the polish and presentation that would later become her entire brand. Her mother, Vicky, was 17 years old when Sandra was born. Her father, John Christensen, was young and largely absent. The family that Sandra grew up in was not stable in any of the ways that children need stability to be. It was fractured and mobile and marked by the kind of poverty that does not simply mean not having enough money. It means not having enough of anything. Not enough security, not enough consistency, not enough of the basic assurance that tomorrow will look roughly like today. Her mother remarried. The man she married was not a good man in the ways that matter most to children. The household that Sandra and her younger siblings grew up in contained things that no child should have to absorb. Instability was the permanent condition. Alcohol was a constant presence. The adult world around them was too consumed by its own chaos to provide the children with what they needed most, which was simply someone paying consistent, careful attention. Sandra became that person. Not for herself, for her siblings. By the time she was 11 years old, she was functioning in some essential ways as the adult of the household. She was cooking for her brothers and sisters. She was managing what resources existed to make sure there was something on the table. She was doing the emotional labor of holding together a group of small people in a situation that was genuinely frightening, with a competence and a steadiness that children her age should not have been required to produce. This is where the cooking came from. Not from a love of food in the leisurely sense. From necessity. From the understanding that if she did not feed her siblings, nobody else was going to. From the discovery that she could take very little and make it into something that looked like enough, and that this ability was the most powerful thing available to her in a world that had given her almost nothing to work with. She went to live with her grandmother, Lorraine, while contributing in Hemet, California when she was around 12 or 13. Her grandmother was a different kind of person from the adults who had populated her early life. Stable, consistent. Someone who paid attention and provided structure and treated Sandra like a person whose interior life mattered. The years with her grandmother gave Sandra something she had never had before. A model of what a household could look like when the person running it was actually present and actually capable and actually committed to the people inside it. She filed for emancipation at 15. She was legally declared an adult before she was old enough to drive. She worked. She saved. She put herself through school with a determination that under the circumstances can only be described as extraordinary. She was building something. She did not have a complete picture of what it was yet, but she knew with a certainty that had been forged in the specific fire of her childhood that it was going to be the opposite of everything she had grown up inside. Building the dream from the outside in Sandra Lee's path to television was not the path of someone who stumbled into opportunity. It was the path of someone who had spent their entire life understanding that if you wanted something, you had to manufacture the conditions for it yourself, because nobody was going to hand it to you. She started with a product called Curtain Craft, window treatment kits that allowed people to make their homes look more finished and more beautiful without spending significant money. She sold them through infomercials in the early 1990s, and the product was successful in the specific way that products sold by someone with genuine conviction and genuine communication ability are successful. She was compelling on camera in a way that was immediately apparent to anyone who watched her. She had warmth and clarity and an instinct for making the person watching feel that what she was offering was exactly what they had been looking for. The window treatments led to other things. A book. More books. The television world started paying attention. And in 2003, the Food Network gave her a show called Semi-Homemade Cooking with Sandra Lee that would run for 11 seasons and make her one of the most recognized faces in American food media. Concept of semi-homemade was not complicated. It was in fact its simplicity that was the genius of it. The idea was that you could take store-bought ingredients and combine them with some fresh elements and a significant amount of presentation skill, and produce something that looked and felt homemade without requiring the time and expertise that truly homemade cooking demanded. It was cooking for people who were busy, for people who wanted their tables to look beautiful and their families to feel cared for without having to spend hours they did not have producing results from scratch. Food critics were not always kind about this. There was a contingent of the culinary world that treated semi-homemade as a compromise of something sacred, as a betrayal of the values that serious cooking represented. They made jokes about the canned goods and the store-bought cake mixes and the particular aesthetic of Sandra Lee's tablescapes, which became famous for their elaborate themed presentations. But the audience understood something the critics missed. Sandra Lee was not talking to people who had the luxury of treating cooking as an art form. She was talking to people whose lives looked a lot like her childhood had looked. People who were doing too much with too little, and who needed someone to tell them that what they could manage was enough. That beautiful was achievable. That their table did not have to be perfect to be worth setting. She was selling something that went much deeper than food. She was selling the possibility of dignity in circumstances that were not designed for it. And she was selling it from a place of genuine personal knowledge because she had lived those circumstances and understood them from the inside. The relationship that deepened a decade in 2005, Sandra Lee met Andrew Cuomo. He was at that point a former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Clinton and was in the process of rebuilding a political career after a failed gubernatorial campaign. She was at the height of her television fame. Two people who had built significant things from difficult beginnings and who recognized in each other a particular kind of ambition and resilience that they had both developed in the same school of hard circumstances. They became a couple. They did not marry. This was a choice that both of them seemed comfortable with and that they maintained across 15 years together. They were a genuine partnership in the way that some unmarried couples are more genuinely partnered than many married ones. They showed up for each other publicly and privately. They navigated the complicated intersection of her media world and his political world, with a coordination that required real communication and real commitment. When Andrew Cuomo was elected governor of New York in 2010, Sandra Lee became the First Lady of New York in every practical sense except the legal one. She attended the official functions, she decorated the executive mansion, she hosted, she represented. She did the work that the partner of a governor does, and she did it with the presentation skill that 20 years of television had given her, and with the genuine warmth that no amount of television training can manufacture if it is not already present. She was also dealing with something privately that the public role made no room for. In 2015, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 48 years old. She handled the diagnosis and the treatment with a public openness that was characteristic of the way she had always operated, turning her personal experience into something that could be useful to other people. She spoke about the double mastectomy she chose to undergo. She spoke about the recovery. She used her platform to bring attention to breast cancer awareness and detection in ways that were genuinely impactful because they were genuinely personal. The relationship with Andrew Cuomo continued. She navigated the years of his governorship, with all of its complexity and its demands and its public pressure, with the same competence she had brought to everything else. And then 2021 arrived and everything that had seemed stable and permanent began to move in ways that nothing in her experience had prepared her for. When everything moves at once in August 2021, Andrew Cuomo resigned as governor of New York following an investigation by the state attorney general that found he had sexually harassed multiple women. The report was detailed and damning. The political world that had been his for over a decade collapsed with a speed that even his most severe critics had not entirely anticipated. Sandra Lee and Andrew Cuomo had already quietly ended their relationship earlier that year. The separation had happened before the most public phase of the scandal. But the timing meant that she was navigating the end of a 15-year relationship at the same moment that the man she had built that relationship with became the subject of one of the most significant political falls from grace in New York history. She said very little publicly. This was consistent with who she had always been in the private dimensions of her life. The public Sandra Lee was warm and open and generous with her experiences when those experiences could be made useful to other people. The private Sandra Lee maintained a perimeter around the things that were genuinely hers. The relationship with Andrew Cuomo in its ending was genuinely hers, and she was not going to process it for public consumption. But she was processing it. And she was doing it at 54 and then 55 years old, which is a particular time in a woman's life to be rebuilding. Not because 55 is old in any meaningful sense, but because there is a specific weight to reconstructing your life at that age that is different from the reconstructions of your 30s or even your 40s. The margin of time feels different. The energy available for starting over feels different. The question of what the next chapter looks like when the previous chapter ended unexpectedly and abruptly is not a question that has easy answers at any age, and it has some particular resonances at 55 that require honest acknowledgement. The health crisis that changed everything, and then came the thing that nobody was expecting. In 2022, Sandra Lee was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and then with coexisting conditions that complicated the Lyme diagnosis and made treatment more difficult and more prolonged than straightforward cases of the disease. She had been experiencing symptoms for a period of time before the diagnosis, the particular cruelty of Lyme disease being that its symptoms are varied and nonspecific enough that the disease frequently goes undiagnosed or misdiagnosed for extended periods while the person experiencing it searches for an explanation for why they feel so profoundly unwell in ways that are difficult to articulate. She spoke about what the illness felt like from the inside with a candor that was characteristic of her. She described the fatigue in terms that went beyond ordinary tiredness into something that affected her ability to do the most basic daily tasks. She described the neurological symptoms, the cognitive fog that made it difficult to think with the clarity and the speed that she had always relied on, the pain, the way that a body that had always been a reliable instrument for achieving what she set out to achieve had become something she was managing around rather than moving through the world with. She had just ended a 15-year relationship. She was rebuilding her professional life outside the context of the partnership with Andrew Cuomo that had shaped her public profile for over a decade. And she was doing all of that while her body was fighting something that medicine was still working to fully understand and effectively treat. This is the convergence that defines the tragic turn that Sandra Lee's story took at 55. Not one catastrophic event, not a single dramatic collapse, but the simultaneous arrival of multiple losses and challenges at a moment in her life when she had perhaps expected to be consolidating rather than rebuilding, when the arc of everything she had constructed seemed like it was pointing toward a kind of arrival, and instead pointed toward something that required her to reach back into the reserves she had built in her childhood and draw on capacities she had hoped she would not need in the same way again. The woman underneath the tablescape. Here is what the tragedy of Sandra Lee's story at 55 actually reveals when you look at it honestly. She built a persona around having it together, around surfaces that were beautiful and tables that were set and presentations that communicated a particular version of abundance and control. She built that persona not from vanity or from a desire to deceive but from the deepest place in her own experience. Because the child who cooked for her siblings in a chaotic household had learned that making things look beautiful was a form of protection, that a well-set table was a statement of intention, that the surface could be an act of love toward the people gathered around it even when the circumstances beneath the surface were difficult and uncertain. The persona was real. That is what the world sometimes missed about Sandra Lee. The tablescape and the semi-homemade cocktails and the themed holiday presentations were not performances of a life she was not actually living. They were the expression of something she genuinely believed and had genuinely fought for. The belief that beauty and care and presentation were not luxuries available only to people whose lives were easy. They were acts of dignity available to anyone willing to reach for them. What the tragedy of her 55th year revealed was the underneath that the tablescapes could not entirely cover. The woman who had been taking care of other people since she was 11 years old and who had never entirely stopped. Who had given 15 years to a partnership that demanded of her a particular kind of selfless support. Who had survived breast cancer and a political scandal and a breakup and now a serious illness essentially by reaching into the same reserves she had first discovered kitchen in California. She asked publicly during the worst of the Lyme disease treatment whether she had been taking care of herself the way she had always taken care of everyone and everything around her. She asked it with the honesty of someone who already knew the answer and was beginning to understand what it had cost her. The answer was no, not because she was careless with herself, but because the template she had built for living had been constructed by a child who learned to survive by being indispensable to the people around her, by making things beautiful for other people, by ensuring that the surface was held together even when everything beneath it was not. That template had served her extraordinarily well in many ways. It had taken her from a chaotic childhood in Santa Monica to a television career that reached millions of people, and a life that contained things the 11-year-old cooking for her siblings could not have imagined. But templates built in childhood in response to childhood circumstances do not always serve the adult life they carry forward into. And at 55, Sandra Lee was confronting the specific cost of hers.